Good afternoon, everyone. Shalom. I'm Tal Heinrich, spokesperson for the Israeli Prime Minister's office. Today is day 235 of the October 7th war, and our war aims remain the same: to destroy Hamas's military and governing capabilities, to free all 125 hostages, and ensure that Gaza does not pose a threat to Israel ever again. All objectives are within reach, and Israel will not compromise on any of them. Firstly, I want to deal with Sunday night's strike against senior terrorists at the Hamas terrorist compound in Rafah. As the Prime Minister said yesterday in the Knesset, quote, "In Rafah, we have evacuated about 1 million civilians. Tragically, despite our immense efforts to avoid harming non-combatants, an incident occurred. We are investigating it thoroughly and will learn from it, as is our policy and long-standing conduct." End quote. The terrorists targeted and eliminated in this strike killed Israeli soldiers and civilians. Indeed, they were meeting to plan further attacks. They directed numerous murderous terror attacks in Judea and Samaria against Israelis. Israel, of course, abides by international humanitarian law. Multiple measures were taken prior to the strike in order to minimize the chances of harm to uninvolved persons. Aerial surveillance, precise munitions, intelligence information. The assessment was made that there would be no expected harm to uninvolved civilians. It's important to emphasize here that contrary to false reports, the strike did not occur in the humanitarian area in Al-Mawasi, to which the IDF has encouraged civilians to evacuate. Later on today, IDF spokesperson Daniel Hagari will reveal the preliminary findings from the IDF's investigation into the incident. We urge you to follow these updates, as they are very, very important to understanding the truth of what happened. Now an update from COGET, which coordinates the entry of aid to Gaza. Yesterday, 378 trucks were transferred into Gaza, including 154 aid trucks that arrived at Kerem Shalom from Egypt. In addition, more than 70 trucks of flour went in via the Ashdod port from the World Food Program. According to COGET, 87% of coordination requests are approved. Since the beginning of the war, more than 30,500 trucks have delivered over 591,000 tons of humanitarian aid into Gaza. More food and aid enters Gaza every day. That's 80% more food compared to what was imported to Gaza before October 7th. The humanitarian aid arrives into Gaza by land, sea, and air. As for our efforts to bring the hostages back home, the Prime Minister has repeatedly given the negotiating team a broad mandate. Sinwar, on the other hand, continues to demand the end of the war, the withdrawal of the IDF from the Gaza Strip, and leaving Hamas in place, in power, so that it will be able to carry out the atrocities of October 7th again and again. The Prime Minister and the people of Israel strongly oppose this. As he said yesterday in the Knesset, quote, "The pressure, both international and domestic, on the Israeli government, which is doing everything possible to secure the hostages' release, only strengthens Sinwar's resolve, leading him to demand terms that would endanger Israel's very existence, terms we cannot accept." Lastly, today, the governments of Norway and Spain have officially given Hamas a prize for their murderous actions when they recognize the Palestinian state, a terror state. This comes after Spain's deputy prime minister signed off a speech saying, quote, "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free." Now, I'm speaking to you from Tel Aviv at the moment, right between that river and that sea, where anyone chanting this hateful slogan believes no Jews should be, dangerously emboldening a fact that has long been known to us. Palestinian terrorists, and unfortunately the masses who support them in both Gaza and the West Bank, never wanted a state next to Israel, but rather one instead of Israel. Before I address your questions today, as we've been doing here for nearly 8 months now, hundreds and hundreds of media interviews and daily briefings, I have a question for you. How come Palestinians are never asked the tough questions? How did their society and UNRWA education system groom such terror monsters like Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad? Why do so many of them, according to recent internal polling, still support terrorism? Why did they reject every peace initiative since 1937? Why are they more committed to the notion of destroying Israel than building themselves and investing in the future? What did they do with billions of dollars that poured in from all over the world for decades? More dollars per capita than the Marshall Plan. How come they are the only group in the world to inherit a fraudulent status of refugees from wars that they themselves started? How come ammunition, terror infrastructure, terror content are found in almost every home across the Gaza Strip? Of course, these are just a few suggestions to anyone interested in promoting peace in the region or reporting the truth about it. I will now take your questions. You can put them in the chat with your full name and news outlet, please.
Thank you. First question from Joel Pollack at Breitbart News. There seems to be some confusion as to whether the strike in Rafah was a tragic mistake, as the Prime Minister put it yesterday, or else a legitimate and properly executed airstrike on a Hamas target in which civilians died inadvertently. Was the strike a mistake, or was it a correct action with tragic, unforeseen circumstances?
First, I would say, thank you, Joel, for your question. It was a tragedy. Either way, it's a tragedy. We've all seen the very disturbing images as they appear on social media. The IDF, Israel, we do not target civilians. We don't want to see any civilian suffering and any civilian casualties in Gaza. We only target the terrorists and their terror infrastructure. Now, that strike that you're referring to, as we said in the briefing, was an intelligence-based one. And it was against terror targets, terrorists who have blood on their hands, responsible for many deaths in Judea and Samaria. And by the way, they were planning to carry out further attacks. So once we had the intelligence about their whereabouts in that specific location, which again, I say it wasn't a humanitarian zone, the humanitarian zone to which the IDF has encouraged civilians, Palestinian civilians to evacuate, we took steps that we usually take before we assess and carry out a strike of this kind on a precise target to ensure that there's no danger to civilians, no risk of harming uninvolved persons. And that's including the aerial surveillance, the assessment of intelligence, as I said, and using the precise munition needed for the operation. Now, I can't tell you much more at this point, and I really urge you to wait and listen to what IDF spokesperson Daniel Hagari has to say, because this incident is still under investigation, but there are some very interesting preliminary findings that the IDF will very shortly reveal today. So anyone interested in the truth of what exactly transpired there should listen to what the IDF has to say about it.
Thank you. Question from Itai Stern from NPR. After the Paris talks during the weekend, what's the current state of the hostages deal negotiations?
So the Prime Minister has given the negotiating team a full, broad mandate to continue to pursue the diplomatic avenue to try to bring to the release of our hostages. As you know, we've had this framework back in November. We saw the release of, more than 100 hostages. There are still 125 of them there. Some are alive, some are not. But we're committed to the principle of leaving nobody behind, and we'll bring everyone home, back to their families. There's no question about it. We must get our stolen people back. We're continuing to pursue this diplomatic avenue in parallel with the military operation. We know that the only thing that works against Hamas is the fact that we're hitting them hard. This is what created the conditions back then to have such a framework in place. And but so far, Hamas, the more flexible Israel has been throughout the negotiations in recent weeks and recent months, as you probably, some of you reported, the more Hamas hardened its positions. Basically, what Hamas wants to see is their terrorist organization remaining in power, in control of the Gaza Strip, with the military capabilities and with the desire to carry out another October 7th massacre and another one, as they vowed to do. And this is something that, Israelis can simply not accept. So we will continue to pursue the diplomatic avenue alongside the military operation to topple Hamas and put more pressure on them. And I can tell you that there are people in Jerusalem and in mediating countries, including in Washington, who are working tirelessly on bringing our people back home.
Thank you. Connected question from Mark Anderson at AFP. Has Israel's position changed since the last round of hostage deal negotiations?
I'm not going to discuss the terms and the nature of the talks that we're having behind the scenes through the international mediators for very obvious reasons that we don't want to risk anything here, and we want to make sure that we're on our part doing everything humanly possible to try to reach another such a framework that will see the release of the remaining hostages. We will do everything that is possible on our end and continue to push for it in various ways. But the terms is not something that we can discuss at this point. What we want to do, of course, is leave Hamas in power. As we stated in the beginning of the briefing, our war aims, they haven't changed since October 7th. We want to dismantle the Hamas terrorist regime, bring the hostages back home, and make sure that Gaza will never, ever pose such a terror threat to us again. But all these war aims, they go hand in hand. They're not contradictory. It's not possible to achieve one without the other also. So it's important to note it.
Thank you. Question from Duri Buskaren for the World from PRX. Mm-hmm. Regarding Kogat, when and from what crossing point will medical evacuations be restarted?
Well, right now we have a few routes, as you know, for the insertion of aid and medical equipment into Gaza, by the way. And there are several field hospitals that are still operational in Gaza. Regarding evacuation efforts of wounded people who need treatment, I will have to ask Kogat exactly what's in the plan. But we have several routes, if I'm not wrong. We have 9 routes, rather, including the Rafah border crossing, from which aid and medical equipment are going in. But as you know, the Rafah border crossing, since we've taken operational control of the Gazan side of it, has not been open, not because we don't want to open it, but because it takes 2 for tango, and you need Egypt to cooperate on this.
Thank you. Question from David Clement from the News Forum in Canada. Mm-hmm. Can the Prime Minister's office confirm the reports that crossfire between the IDF and militants killed an Egyptian soldier?
Let's wait for the IDF spokesperson update on that too.
Question from Hannah Julian at the Jewish Press. There are reports that the massive fire that resulted from the attack on Hamas in Rafah actually took place 1 kilometre from the safe zone and resulted from secondary explosions in a car filled with rockets and other ordnance. Can you confirm?
A little more patient, just a few more minutes, maybe an hour or so, and I believe you'll get an answer to that question too from the IDF spokesperson.
Second question from Hannah Julian at the Jewish Press. There are reports that the US Navy's floating pier has entirely broken away from the Gaza coast and is also in danger of sinking. Can you confirm the status of the pier? And if true, will it be rebuilt?
Well, I've seen several reports or images floating on social media, but Again, this is something that you'll have to wait for the IDF to give answers about. As far as I know, that pier was still operational for the delivery of aid and is one of the 9 different routes that are available from around the Gaza Strip for the insertion of aid. As I said, more than 591,000 tons of humanitarian aid were facilitated into Gaza since the beginning of the war. And that pier, an initiative, an idea that was formed in Israel, an initiative carried out with CENTCOM, Central Command from the United States, is one more such avenue that really enhanced our efforts to bring aid in.
Thank you. That was the last question.
Thank you. That concludes the daily briefing for today. We'll see you here tomorrow.